I would still fail that drugs test. I was finding it really difficult to get to sleep at night. Sometimes honestly feeling like I was gonna hurt myself, which, yeah, is pretty scary. I wanted to be like everybody else. All right, and action. I have completely avoided talking about my ADHD journey on this channel and online for the last few months for many reasons, which I will get into in this video. But now that I've completely changed how I view this ADHD diagnosis, I think it's the right time to be completely honest with you all. The first thing I want to stress before I get into my diagnosis, my background, medication, next steps, I must stress this is my personal experience and everyone is different, and nothing in this video constitutes advice, be it medical advice or practical advice for anyone, ADHD or not. Crystal clear disclaimer. Let's take it back to the beginning. Or I guess the beginning of the diagnosis, because ADHD didn't begin this time last year, but this time last year, just before the London Marathon, in the taper, I had my ADHD assessment and I received a diagnosis. The very first thing they offered me to help with symptoms was medication, which I felt quite uncomfortable with at the time because I was in the taper for the London Marathon, and starting a new medication before a race, regardless of any side effects or whether that medication is allowed to be taken when you're racing and training, just didn't feel like a smart idea. Ooh, it's a floating caterpillar. What do I do with this? There's a stick here. Okay, nice to meet you, caterpillar. Can you go? Thank you, goodbye. Where was I? ADHD. I asked them to come back to me after the London Marathon because 10 days out from a race is no time to be starting a new medication. On top of that, with most ADHD medications, you have to consider anti-doping, which is a whole other thing that I'm going to get into. So I run the London Marathon, that goes not great. I reached back out to the person that assessed me, who would also be prescribing these drugs, and said, let's give it a go. The reason I decided to try medication is because I've seen how much ADHD impacts my life, my work life, my personal life, how frustrating it is and how frustrated I get of myself. And to be honest, at that time, I thought maybe it would solve everything. And even if it didn't solve everything, surely it's gotta help quite a bit. After thinking about it and deciding that if I didn't try, I would always think, what if? I decided to try the medication. I was given a prescription for a titration plan to titrate onto this long-acting, slow-release stimulant medication. I wasn't given a choice as to which one I took, but it was just given the one that the person who was prescribing me recommended I take. And it started to help. I noticed that I was able to focus more on my work. I had motivation for tasks that I previously would be extremely unmotivated for, and I was getting distracted less. I was less inattentive. All of the things that get in my way, it sort of turned the volume down on. There were some very notable side effects, which I'm gonna get into in a little bit, but I wasn't naive to the fact that there would be side effects. And I think the reason the timing was right to try medication was I knew that whatever I did over the summer was pretty low pressure. So not only could I deal with some side effects, deal with maybe kissing some frogs in the sense that the medication might not work for me, but I had to give it a go. I had a pretty open path in front of me in terms of maybe I'll race this summer, maybe I won't, but actually prioritizing this and trying to help myself is really important. That way of looking at it was also very useful when it came to the anti-doping side of things. So the stimulant medications that are prescribed for ADHD, including the one that I was prescribed, are in a classification of substances that are not banned outside of competition. So every day at training, whether I'm doing a workout or an easy run, I'm allowed to take that medication. It's not prohibited by World Athletics rules. If I was to be drugs tested at training, before training, after training, if it comes up on a test, it's not a violation. However, they are banned in competition unless you have a therapeutic use exemption, which is what people with ADHD who have this medication prescribed need to get. So the situation I was in was that I was allowed to train whilst on this medication without any documentation or needing a certificate to say that I'm allowed to take this medication, but I wasn't allowed to compete. If I did compete and was tested at that race, or from midnight before the race to midnight after the race, and that stimulant comes up on the test, that is a violation unless you have a therapeutic use exemption in place. And this is where I found myself in a bit of a stressful position, if I'm honest, because I'm not going to enter myself into a race or stand on a start line if I'm not compliant with the rules. If I need a therapeutic use exemption to be taking this drug and racing, I'm going to get that piece of paper. However, it is not that simple. as I found. I did the right thing, contacted UK Anti-Doping, explained to them that I had been assessed for ADHD, received a diagnosis, and prescribed by a doctor with this medication to treat my clinical condition, ADHD. That's what you're supposed to do. There's a big fact sheet on UKAD that explains how to apply for a TUE, whether it's for ADHD or not. But unfortunately, I was met with some resistance from UK Anti-Doping. I was told that I did not need a TUE in order to race because I was not in the relevant testing pool. That basically means I'm not good enough for them to want to test me, that I need the TUE to say, hey guys, I actually need to take this drug. In case you test me, we're all good here. To be completely honest, I found that really infuriating because less than a year prior, I ran the Olympic qualifying time in Berlin, and that didn't constitute me as being a high enough level as an athlete for them to think that they should be testing me or that I should have this certificate with me if I was to be tested. And the alternative that they gave me by saying, you're not in the testing pool, so we don't need to do this paperwork here because you're basically not a high enough level of an athlete, is that you can race without the TUE whilst taking this medication, but if you do get tested, if we decide to test you at a race, you then need to get a retroactive TUE, because I would still fail that drugs test. Without a TUE by my side to say, by the way, this medication I'm taking, it's gonna come up on the test, but I'm allowed to take it. You guys have said that we're all good. I would fail a drugs test. And then without a TUE going into that drugs test, the only option you have is applying for a retroactive TUE. Now, that's very different from applying for a TUE before going into a race, because if you apply for a TUE going into a race and let's say they come back to you a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the race and say, no, there's not enough evidence here, we've decided to not give you this TUE, or we want to check a few things, we're not going to give it to you yet, I then don't race and I don't get a violation, I don't fail a drugs test. Whereas if they say you don't need a TUE, I do race and then get tested and fail a test, my only option is pursuing a retroactive TUE. And if they then come back and say, we don't agree with what the clinical assessor has said, we don't agree with the evidence that you've submitted, we don't think that you should be taking this drug, then I've got a doping violation. And that blew my mind. Thankfully, after doing some research and speaking to other athletes, I pushed back against this and said to them that I should be in the national testing pool because I had run an Olympic qualifying time the year prior. Granted, it was outside of the window, but I was also running world major marathons, which is of a level of competition that does qualify you to be in the national testing pool. Therefore, they really should be entertaining the idea of drugs testing me and allowing me to put in a TUE application. Thankfully, that worked, and I was then able to put in my TUE application alongside all of the evidence submitted from my clinical assessor, my psychiatrist, all of the dates, my assessment, etc., which was a relief, not only from my own standpoint of I want to be able to race, so I want to pursue getting this TUE so that I can not have to choose between racing and looking after my mental health and pursuing treatment for my ADHD symptoms, but it also means that I am committing to and buying into clean sport, which we all should be doing if we want to protect this sport. That part of the process was probably the most infuriating because it just made me think, who are we actually testing? If it's this difficult to do things by the book, what's happening here? So we're on the other side of that process now, and I hear back from the panel, the committee that you submit your therapeutic use exemption application to, and it was successful. Yay, I'm allowed to take these drugs and I'm allowed to race. I got that decision back in July last year. So whilst I also had a lot of other stuff going on in my life at the time, that explains why I didn't race between London and going out to the US before I did Falmouth, because I didn't have this TUE in place. I then knuckled down into the Chicago Marathon training block. I raced Falmouth, that goes terrible. I'm getting deeper and deeper into the marathon block. And although I've settled on the right dose now in terms of the side effects and the symptoms being managed, I'm starting to notice that although I am better at focusing, I'm less distracted, I'm less inattentive, I'm a lot more stimulated all of the time by nature of being on stimulant medication. All of that is great to an extent, but there's no way of switching that off when you don't want to be stimulated anymore. When I need to recover, I definitely can't take a nap. I was finding it really difficult to get to sleep at night. That petered off from the kind of insomnia, I'm awake having a bowl of cereal at 4 a.m. in the early stages, but what I really lost that was so alien to me that was always there in a marathon block was the deep urge and desire to go to bed from being tired, sometimes so tired from training. I just didn't have that natural signal, which is red flag number one. Red flag number two was that I really struggled to eat. And with a history of disordered eating, this was difficult in itself, and I recognized it straight away, but it was weird because it comes from a place of just not being hungry. And when it's really bad and compounded with really intense training, I was pretty repulsed by the sight and the smell and the idea of eating food. And this was at its worst in the middle part of my day. So if I take my medication at, say, 7 a.m., it's working its way through my system and peaking at around 10 a.m. and it stays there and then gradually peters off. Between the hours of 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., really difficult to get me to eat a meal. So I'm relying heavily on liquid lunches, smoothies, snacking, high calorie foods, just to get enough calories in and carbohydrates to recover from my training or prepare for the next training session. And over time, that became pretty exhausting. And to be honest, although I kept taking the medication for a decent amount of time after the Chicago block, I think that was the sign to me that it wasn't going to be super sustainable to take this medication alongside what I do for work. Because energy in and energy out is a real basic for being a marathon runner. I then, at the end of a pretty successful block in Flagstaff, getting ready for Chicago, get injured. We come home. I am now faced with how running had medicated my ADHD for pretty much my whole life up until this point. And that didn't feel like a great time to consider whether I should come off this medication and whether that was right for me. Because whilst I didn't have running to lean on, I really did have to lean on these ADHD meds. And I was used to having them in my system at that point. But the questions were starting to be asked, and I was starting to consider at that point whether there could be something else I could try. And I don't think it's entirely surprising that being injured, losing running, which has been not just a coping mechanism for my ADHD, but just a way to regulate myself and run the whole rhythm of my life for so many years, I don't think it was wholly surprising that my headspace took a pretty big nosedive. A couple of things I noticed at this time, which I can't know whether it's related to the medication or not. It could have just been the fact that I was injured in a really bad headspace, but I had a few really intense anger outbursts, which is super uncharacteristic for me. I couldn't tell you the last time I had one of those pre this period of time at home whilst I was injured, and since coming off the medication, I haven't had one. I did do a little bit of research into it, and it's not conclusive, but there are people that report side effects of increased irritability, and I wonder if that played into it. But I got myself into this really kind of scary place when something would go wrong or I couldn't find something, and that kind of snowballed really quickly from a 0 to 100 of me like throwing something at the wall or breaking something, or sometimes honestly feeling like I was gonna hurt myself, which is pretty scary. The new year comes around, I'm easing back into running, and I've thought about it some more and decide that this medication either isn't the right fit for me, or medication as a whole of the stimulant variety isn't right for me. I chat to my prescriber, explain the reasons why, talk about the side effects, and they suggest that I try a different stimulant medication that has a little bit of a flatter release profile. It has kind of like 2 mini peaks rather than peaking right up and then coming down in the system, and they sort of explain, hey, this actually might be a better fit for you. It's kind of a 50-50 stab in the dark as to whether we get it right when we prescribe you one of these 2 main medications for long-acting stimulants in the first place. Why don't you try this other drug? I did that in January, came off the first medication that I was on, which was horrible because you do get withdrawal symptoms and your body is used to being on stimulant medication, and then all of a sudden it's not. So I felt pretty terrible, pretty useless, pretty numb, pretty demotivated, very emotionally unstable. And then I started the titration process onto this second drug. And I don't want to spend a ton of time here, but I would say that in terms of side effects, it was probably 25% better than the first medication, but I came to the same conclusion in the end. I was way too productive in the evening. It was clearly still in my system, and it just felt like I was trying to fix my ADHD with this medication and not considering my health as a whole and how important it is to me as an athlete to get adequate recovery and get adequate fuel in, because those side effects were still there. So I decided to come off the medication. Probably not advisable to do this without speaking to your prescriber first, but that is what I did, and I just stopped taking it about 6 weeks ago, and the first week to 2 weeks was really tough. I experienced the same withdrawal side effects as I did the first time around and kind of knew what was coming there. Really tempting just to stick a band-aid on the situation and start taking the medication again, but I didn't do that. And now I have reached my equilibrium where I am my normal self, and normal for me means pretty chaotic. I have ADHD, and I don't have a pill that I can take that is gonna just fix that, and I think that is where I have a problem. My problem is that when I got that ADHD diagnosis, it didn't really feel like a relief. I hear so many stories about people saying, oh, it explained why I am the way I am. It was such a relief. I could be kinder to myself. I tried to feel those things, but it just confirmed what I already knew, and I wanted to fix it. I wanted to be like everybody else. I wanted to not have ADHD. I wanted to be on time. I wanted to not be messy. I wanted to remember things. I wanted to get down to my work and get on with it rather than getting distracted. And that's not something I can just decide because my brain works differently. And I think I naively looked at medication as something that might fix me and make me like everyone else. Now, I am definitely not all of the way there yet, and I still struggle with that way of thinking, but I am coming around to the fact that I can't fix myself, and this isn't something that needs to be fixed. I'm not gonna be like everybody else because, well, I'm me. And I need to accept that my brain works in its own way. That doesn't mean that I'm just gonna let my ADHD dictate my life. I'm still gonna work on this, but I'm gonna work on it with some tools, working in person with professionals to learn how to help myself and not rely on a drug that I'm gonna take once a day to solve all of my problems. And I know that that's not what it is marketed as. I know that's not what it is supposed to be. But I think that if anyone is going to take ADHD medication, you can't naively go into it thinking it's going to solve all your problems. It has to come in alongside all of these other things. And that wasn't the case for me. I wasn't offered any of those things. I still haven't been offered any of that help. I'm reaching out and finding it myself, but I'm doing it without the drugs to complement it. Because that's just not a good fit for me and my lifestyle. I need those natural signals of when I'm tired and when I'm hungry to be able to do what I do. And also, I think I need a little bit of the ADHD in me as well. It's so easy to look at other people around you who have something you don't, or that work in a different way. I am so envious of my organized friends, my friends that have their shit together, as I would say. But maybe those same friends look at me and think, wow, Phily, you are so creative. You are able to think spontaneously. I love your hyperactive energy. And those are things that I maybe take for granted and think are just a part of me when, yes, they are, but they're also impacted by my ADHD. So whilst it makes things difficult sometimes and takes some things away from me, and I have to work a little bit harder than everyone else to be on time, to be organized, or to be as organized and on time as I can be, I also have this other way of thinking that does give me a creative edge, that does help me think differently and come up with ideas and ultimately do what I'm doing. I'm just in one big long hyperfocus and I am obsessed with running. That's ADHD. Like, that's cool. I found my thing, I've locked into it, and I know what I love. And that's the update of the grind.